Ben Webster's music and, realized, he's a great musician.
You were a big fan of Coleman Hawkins at the time.
He was my idol.
What was it about Ben's sound that may have been a little bit different than Coleman Hawkins?
Well, Ben's sound, of course, was much more gruff, and yet he had a very sweet sound also, but he had sort of a more gruff sort of approach, and it was distinctive, very, very distinctive. The great Eddie Lockjaw Davis was once called Baby Ben because Eddie had that sort of gruff approach to playing, that Ben originated,
Was there a competition between Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins? I mean, in Kansas
I
City,
imagine. Oh yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
in Kansas City, there were these battles where they really tried to. They went head to head.
Right.
Friendly competition.
Yeah.
Do you think that that was something that they were conscious of, or just something that happened in a jam session?
They were conscious of it.
Yeah, the fact that I'm Ben Webster, I have to play a certain way to show people that I can stand up to the other tenor players.
Well, yeah, that was part of the how shall I say, in the DNA of jazz people. We had the cutting contest. That was just part of the way it went.
Did you know Ben personally?
I knew Ben personally. Yeah.
Can you share with us anything about Ben the man?
Well, I didn't know him that personally to know everything about him. For instance, Jim Hall, the guitarist, told me that he knew Ben. He said when Ben was young, he was sort of, his grandmother and everybody had him sort of like a little Lord Fauntleroy when he was in school, with the knickers and all this stuff. So this is quite the opposite image you would have of the gruff Ben Webster. So I never knew that until I spoke to Jim. But Ben was a very, I think Ben Webster one time thought he could beat up Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion. I think he, I don't know if he took a punch at Joe Louis or something, but Ben had a very strong macho thing about him, so that this was sort of part of his persona,
Is that why they called him the Brute?
Yeah, yeah.
But he had like another side. Just his ballad playing is just unbelievably sensitive.
Right. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. He was very, very, very sensitive. He wasn't gruff as his more other songs that he played that were, more up-tempo and so forth.
Lester Young. When did you
Yes.
first become aware of Prez?
Well, Brett, I on my block where I lived, we had a lot of people were very much involved in jazz. I mean, we all loved jazz from all of people my age and so on. So I was a big Coleman Hawkins fan by that time. So one day a friend of mine came down the street. He said, "Sonny, who's the greatest tenor player in the world?" So I said, "Coleman Hawkins." So he said, "No, Lester Young." So I said, "What do you mean Lester Young? Coleman Hawkins." So anyway, I said, "Well, let me find out who this Lester Young is, And then I began. I'd probably heard Lester Young, but not knowing a lot about him. Then I began realizing why somebody might say that. You know, Lester was nonpareil.
When Lester arrived, he was like stylistically diametrically opposed to Coleman Hawkins.
I think you could say that. I think you could say there were two styles, roughly, the Coleman Hawkins style and the way Lester Young started playing. People in the Coleman Hawkins style would have included Ben Webster in a sense. And people like Herschel Evans, the great co-saxophone player in the Count Basie band with Lester, they would be in the Coleman Hawkins side. Now these are rough lines we're drawing here. This isn't, as time goes on and we begin to understand, then we realize that it's not quite that black and white, it's a little more nuanced. And as years go by, it becomes much more nuanced. At least in my case, I appreciate both Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins and try to use both of their styles to build my efforts on, So it can get much more nuanced than it was back then. See, back then there was two camps, as you correctly alluded. Yes, Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young.
Lester Young, the man, was kind of a unique individual, kind of a fellow who marched to the beat of his own drum, so to speak, with his own language, his own
Yeah,
way of life.
yeah.
For those of us who weren't there, can you tell us something about Lester the man?
Well, he was very inventive. Like you hear these hip hop guys today that create little fast lines about things. Lester was like that. Lester would have a name for everything, a nickname for everything, a way of defining something. Everything was instantaneous, and genius-like. There was just nothing like it. A lot of people began copying, of course, like cool. Oh, it's cool. Oh, Lester Young he might have been the first guy to say that. I don't know. It's possible. A lot of his sayings have become common. But yeah, he was really a great trip that I'm on in life, to have known all these people. You see, this is fantastic that I knew Lester Young and knew Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins, all these people. These are great people. And believe me, I know that I've been blessed. Okay.
Lester Young's playing has a certain sensitivity. Do you think he was a sensitive kind of a guy? I mean, he had, unfortunately, a short life. I know he was a horrible problem in the Army during World War II. Do you think that his sensitivity as an individual is reflected in the way that he plays?
I think, I think he was a sensitive musician and a person, yeah. I think that's why he probably It's hard to analyze people. I mean, every musician is sensitive. Ray
Right.
Nance, the trumpet and violin player with Duke Ellington, he was a sensitive person. You know, I knew Ray well, and you know, all these guys are sensitive. Lester's playing had that sort of, you could really feel the sensitivity in his playing. So, you know, he revealed it in his work probably more than a lot of people. So you could hear that melancholy, you know.
Let's just jump over to Coleman Hawkins for a second. One of your first major influences was Louis Jordan.
Right.
What was it about Hawkins that grabbed you when you first heard him?
Well, you know, Brett, Hawkins had a little more, how should I say, intellectual capacity to his playing. If you could describe Louis Jordan as earthy and more direct, Coleman Hawkins was more subtle. There was so much more depth to what he played. And there was a musical depth. I mean, the things that Coleman Hawkins were playing were on a par with what people would think of as Stravinsky or one of the classical artists of Europe who made musical contributions which changed the idioms. You see, so Coleman Hawkins' music was on that level. He was playing things which were to influence a lot of people, a lot of styles, and getting really playing music theory. You see, Louis Jordan wasn't necessarily playing musical theory. Louis Jordan was playing, you know, gut, from the gut greatly, and so that you have to be sure not to say, well, this is better than that, or this is better. I don't want to make that
No.
judgment. They were separate,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
both and. So, but in Coleman Hawkins, this is what attracted me to him, because to be able to understand what Coleman Hawkins was doing, you had to know more music. I mean, you know, maybe with Louis Jordan you had to know music, but there's more feeling, you know. But with Coleman Hawkins, you know, you had to know theory in order to play like that. And that was a challenge, and something that I saw as a young aspiring musician. I saw that this was, I better learn this, you see. So that would be the difference, I would say.
Now, in 1939, when he released Body and Soul, that was, in essence, state-of-the-art improvisation at the time. I mean, that was just an unbelievable statement. Was it recognized in the musical community as the important piece of art that it was?
Well, remember, I was only 9 years old at that time. So I can't speak for the musical community. I do know that it was ubiquitous on the jukeboxes of Harlem. You know, you could go in any place in the jukeboxes in those days, and that's what you'd hear. That would be on all the jukeboxes, you know, which in itself was a revelation, because I know Thelonious Monk once asked Coleman Hawkins, he said, Hawk, how could you make a song that's a ballad with words, lyrics, and you played, and you didn't play the melody, and you didn't, there was no words, and still it became a hit. You know, so this is still this is, the man created, I mean, Body and Soul was a masterpiece. It still is, it'll always be. And far be it beyond me to explain it, but it was, you know, it's why Coleman Hawkins is in the firmament, you know, of this music.
So you grew up and you heard him, his music affected you. Some years later, you played with him, you recorded with him.
And that's true.
What was that like for you to be with someone, to collaborate with someone that you admired so greatly like that, that had such an influence on you? Did you feel, were you in awe of him when you played with him?
I was always in awe of him. I had gotten to know Coleman before that. I mean, before we made a record together. He had heard of me and all this stuff, and I think he heard me and all this, and, you know, so he expressed that, yeah, he liked me, you know, like this young guy, Sonny Rollins, and all this stuff. So when we played together, it wasn't like the first meeting, you know, we were already familiar with each other. But yeah, I was in a certain awe of him, and it presented a challenge how to play myself, but still be natural and normal in myself while I still had this feeling of awe for him, you know. But I'm glad we did make those records together, and we also played together up at Newport, and it was my great honor and a great blessing, and to have the opportunity to do that, you know. Really very, more than grateful to, as I said before, to have been with all these people.